The dog's name was Kodiak, and he came through the ER doors at 11:47 on a Tuesday night, draped across the arms of a man who was barely holding himself together. Nurse Petra Wynne was the first one to see them. She had been charting at the nurse's station, the kind of mindless end-of-shift charting that turns your eyes glassy and your fingers automatic. When the automatic doors slid open, and Sergeant First Class Darian Cole walked in carrying 70 pounds of injured military working dog like he was carrying his own child. Cole's left sleeve was soaked through. Not his blood, Kodiak's. The shepherd mix had a deep laceration running from his left shoulder down toward his foreleg, and the bandaging Cole had wrapped around it in the field had already failed. Cole wasn't saying anything. He was just walking, his jaw set, his eyes scanning the room the way soldiers scan rooms. Threat assessment, exits, allies, until they landed on Petra. She was already moving. "How long ago?" she asked, pulling on gloves as she crossed the floor. 40 minutes, maybe 50. We had to wait for extraction. Was he conscious the whole time? In and out. Kodiak's eyes found her face. That was the thing she noticed first. Not the blood, not the wound, but the way the dog looked at her, steady, exhausted, trusting in that particular way that animals trust when they've decided to stop fighting. "Follow me," she said. She did not stop to ask permission. There was a treatment bay at the far end of the hall. Bay 6, that was technically unused that night. It wasn't a veterinary facility. Mercy General was not set up for animals. There were no veterinary protocols on record, no animal-specific medications charted in the dispensary, no veterinarian on call. What there was a dog bleeding out in the arms of a soldier who had run out of options, and a nurse who had grown up on a farm in central Kentucky and had spent 4 years working alongside a rural vet before she went to nursing school, and who understood, in the way that some people understand things that aren't written in any manual, that the principles of wound care are not species-specific. She got Kodiak onto the table. Cole stood at the edge of the bay and watched her work, and she could see him breathing, slow, controlled, the kind of breathing men learn when they've been trained to stay functional under pressure. "You can stay," she told him, "but I need you quiet." He nodded once and went still. What she found under the failed field bandage was bad but manageable. The laceration was long and ragged. Something sharp, probably wire or metal sheeting, had caught him at an angle, but it hadn't hit anything vital. The bleeding was significant but not arterial. She irrigated the wound with saline. She debrided the edges. She worked methodically, the way she always worked, with the particular kind of calm that isn't the absence of feeling, but the decision to set it aside until later. Kodiak made one sound, a low, involuntary whine, when she irrigated the deepest part of the cut. Cole's hand moved to the dog's head without thinking, and Kodiak went quiet. She closed the wound with interrupted sutures, 43 of them. She counted because counting steadied her hands. She had just finished the last one when the door opened. Hospital Administrator Gwen Farley did not look like someone who had been woken up. She looked like someone who had been waiting for exactly this moment. Her hair was perfect. Her blazer was buttoned. She stood in the doorway of Bay 6 and took in the scene, the dog on the table, the soldier at the wall, the nurse with bloody gloves and a suture kit, and her expression did something complicated and then settled into the kind of administrative blankness that is worse than anger. "Win," she said. "Step outside." Petra pulled off her gloves. She looked at Cole. "He's stable. Keep him warm. Don't let him lick the sutures." Cole looked at her, just for a second. "Thank you," he said. And she heard everything he wasn't saying, the exhaustion, the relief, the particular gratitude of someone who had been told no too many times in the past hour. She walked out into the hall. Farley let the door close behind them. She stood with her arms crossed and her voice very low, which Petra had learned to read as the sign that the conversation was already over. "You treated an animal in this facility. I treated a military working dog in a trauma situation. This is not a veterinary clinic, Wynne. No. It's an emergency room." He was bleeding. Farley's eyes were flat. "You used hospital supplies, hospital equipment, an active treatment bay. I used saline, basic suture materials, and a trauma table. Bay 6 was empty. That is not the point." Farley's voice dropped another notch. "The point is that you made a unilateral decision to expose this hospital to significant liability without authorization, without protocol, and without consulting anyone with the authority to make that call." Petra looked at her. She thought about the 43 sutures. She thought about Kodiak's eyes finding her face when he was brought in. With respect, she said, there wasn't time. There is always time to make a phone call. Petra said nothing. I'm suspending you pending review, Farley said. Effective immediately. You'll surrender your badge to security. HR will contact you about next steps. For a moment, Petra just stood there in the hallway of the hospital where she had worked for 6 years, where she had held hands with people who were dying and called families with the worst news of their lives, and come back shift after shift because she believed, genuinely and without irony, that it mattered, and she felt something shift inside her. Not break, just shift. Okay, she said. She went to get her badge. The security officer who walked her out was a young man named Tyler who had never once spoken to her in 2 years of passing each other in hallways. He looked mortified. He kept his eyes forward. He held the exit door open for her without making eye contact, and she walked through it and stood in the employee parking lot in the November cold, with her jacket in her bag and her keys in her hand and her hospital badge no longer attached to her lanyard. She sat in her car for a long time without starting it. She thought about calling her sister. She thought about calling her union rep. She thought about calling her mother, who would immediately assume someone had died and would spend 10 minutes asking clarifying questions before Petra could explain what had actually happened. She thought about a lot of things. She started the car and drove home. Her apartment was quiet in the way apartments get when you've been working nights for years, and the quiet starts to feel less like peace and more like the absence of everything. She fed her cat, a gray tabby named after nobody, and she sat at her kitchen table, and she looked at her hands. They were steady. They were always steady when she was working. It was afterward that they sometimes shook. She did not cry. She was not by nature a person who cried easily. But she sat at that table for a long time in the dark, and she thought about Farley's voice. There is always time to make a phone call. And she thought about the dog on the table and the soldier at the wall, and she could not make those two things reconcile inside her. She went to bed at 4 a.m. and did not sleep well. The calls started the next afternoon. The first one was from her union rep, a methodical woman named Gail, who asked careful questions and wrote things down and told Petra not to speak to hospital administration without her present. The second was from a colleague named Jess, who had been on shift and had seen everything, and who was furious in the particular way that people get furious when they witness something unjust happening to someone else. The third was a number she didn't recognize. She almost didn't answer it. "Miss Wynne," said the voice on the other end. It was male, measured with the particular cadence of someone who chooses words deliberately. "My name is Chief Warrant Officer Brian Nakamura. I'm calling because I was briefed on what happened at Mercy General last night." Petra sat down on her couch. "How did you get this number?" "Sergeant Cole gave it to me." "I hope that's all right." She thought about that. "Is Kodiak okay?" A pause. Brief. Something in it she couldn't quite read. "He's doing well. The vet cleared him this morning." The sutures held. She let out a breath she hadn't entirely known she was holding. "Mrs. Wynne," Nakamura said, "I'd like to understand what happened, not the hospital's version." "Yours." So she told him. She told him about Cole coming through the doors. She told him about the wound and the sutures and Bay 6. She told him about Farley in the hallway and the badge surrendered to Tyler and the parking lot in the November cold. She told him all of it in the same tone she used to brief incoming nurses at shift change. Clear, sequenced, factual, and when she was done, there was a silence on the line. "Thank you," Nakamura said finally. "I'll be in touch." She had no idea what that meant. 3 days passed. She spent most of them doing the things you do when your routine has been suddenly removed, sleeping later than usual, drinking more coffee than was sensible, going for long walks through her neighborhood in the gray November light, and looking at things without really seeing them. She reorganized her kitchen cabinets. She read half a novel. She called her sister, who was appropriately outraged, and then pivoted to talking about Thanksgiving plans, which was honestly a relief. Gail called to tell her that the hospital's formal review process would begin within the week, and that based on the documentation Gail had already reviewed, there were several procedural irregularities in how the suspension had been handled that she was planning to raise. Petra listened and said yes at appropriate intervals and felt the particular kind of numb that isn't peace. On the third night, Jess texted her, "People are talking." Not in a bad way. Just so you know, she didn't know what that meant either. She found out the following morning. It was a Thursday. She had just made coffee when her phone began showing notifications with a frequency she associated with emergencies, a rapid-fire cluster of them, one after another, from numbers and apps she hadn't checked in days. She sat down and opened them, and what she found was that Jess's text from the night before had been, if anything, an understatement. Someone had talked. She would never find out exactly who or how, whether it was Cole himself or someone on his team or someone at the base who had heard the story secondhand and passed it along. But somewhere in the previous 72 hours, the story of what had happened in Base 6 had moved from a hospital hallway to a base to a group chat to the internet, and it had done what stories do when they hit the right nerve at the right moment. It had spread. She was not named in most of it. That was the first thing she checked, with her stomach tight. In most versions, she was simply a nurse at Mercy General, which she found more manageable. But the story itself was there. The dog, the soldier, the ER at midnight, the administrator, the suspension. And people were responding to it with the specific fervor that the internet reserves for stories about animals and injustice and people who do the right thing and get punished for it. She put her phone face down and drank her coffee. The phone kept buzzing. She turned it back over and called Gail. "I've seen it," Gail said, before Petra could speak. "Don't say anything publicly. Don't respond to anyone. Don't talk to media if they reach out. Are you hearing me?" "Yes, this changes things," Gail said. "I don't know yet how, but it does." What happened next, Petra would piece together later from things she was told and things she observed and a few things she was never entirely sure about. What she knew was this. On Friday morning, 2 days after the story appeared online, a convoy of vehicles arrived at Mercy General. Not flashy, not dramatic in the way you might imagine. Just 4 dark SUVs pulling into the main lot at 7:45 in the morning, followed by a staff car, followed by 2 more vehicles with base plates. The kind of arrival that people notice not because it announces itself loudly, but because it doesn't announce itself at all, and that absence has its own weight. Jess, who was coming off a night shift, saw them from the parking structure and texted Petra, "Something is happening at the hospital. Are you coming in?" Petra had not been called back. She was still suspended, technically. She had no official reason to be there. She drove there anyway. She parked in the lot across the street and sat in her car and watched, which is an objectively strange thing to do, but which felt, at the time, like the only appropriate response. She could see the entrance from where she was parked. She watched the SUVs. She watched a man in uniform climb out of the staff car. She couldn't see his rank from that distance, but his bearing was unmistakable, the particular posture that belongs to people who have been in command for a long time. She watched 2 more men follow him, and then several others, and then the whole group walked into the hospital with the quiet efficiency of people who know exactly where they're going and exactly what they're there to do. Her phone rang. It was Nakamura. "Ms. Wynn," he said. "Are you available to come in?" She looked at the entrance across the street. "I'm actually already here." Another one of those brief pauses. "Of course you are," he said, and she thought she heard something in his voice that might have been approval. "Come to the main entrance. Someone will meet you." The person who met her was not who she expected. She had expected a junior officer, or maybe a hospital liaison, or Nakamura himself. Instead, she walked through the automatic doors and found Sergeant Darian Cole standing in the lobby, still and composed, with Kodiak sitting at his left side. The dog was wearing his vest. His left foreleg was lightly bandaged. He looked, Petra thought, extraordinarily dignified for an animal who 3 days ago had been draped over a man's arms with a wound that needed 43 sutures. Kodiak saw her before Cole did. The dog's tail began to move. Cole looked down at Kodiak, then looked up and found her, and something in his face changed. The controlled blankness of it, the careful soldier composure. "Just for a moment. Just enough." "He remembers you," Cole said. She crossed the lobby and crouched down in front of Kodiak and let him sniff her hand. He licked her wrist with great solemnity, the way dogs do when they've made a decision about you. She put her hand on his head and felt him lean into it, and she had to press her lips together for a moment to keep her expression where she wanted it. "How's the leg?" she asked. "Vet says it's healing well. Said whoever closed it did good work." She stood up. "Nakamura called me, I know. I asked him to." Cole met her eyes. I owe you an explanation and an apology. She looked at him. For what? For not being the one to call sooner. For letting it get to this. He glanced toward the far end of the lobby, where she could see the group of officers she'd watched from the parking lot gathered outside what appeared to be the administrative wing. What they did to you wasn't right. And it shouldn't have taken 3 days and a public story for anyone to do something about it. She didn't know what to say to that. She wasn't used to being apologized to by people who had no obligation to apologize. Come on, Cole said. The colonel wants to meet you. His name was Colonel Wen Sato, and he had the kind of face that had seen too many things and had come out the other side of all of it without bitterness, which Petra found remarkable and slightly disorienting. He was standing in the hallway outside the administrative wing with 2 of his officers and a man in a suit who turned out to be from the hospital's parent company, not Mercy General itself but the corporate entity above it, and he shook her hand and looked at her directly and said, I understand you saved my unit's dog. I cleaned and closed a wound, she said. His sergeant did the rest. Sato looked at Cole. Something passed between them, the kind of communication that develops between people who have worked together long enough that words become shorthand. Then Sato looked back at her. We've been in a conversation with hospital leadership since yesterday afternoon, he said. I want you to know, because I think you deserve to know what that conversation has looked like. He walked her through it with the directness of someone who respects other people's time. The Army's relationship with Mercy General predated Sato's posting. The hospital was a preferred provider for personnel and their families on and around the base. That relationship, Sato explained, was worth something specific and measurable to the hospital, not just reputationally, but contractually. When a story about a nurse being suspended for emergency care of a military working dog moved through that network, it moved fast, and it moved with a particular kind of charge that attached to things involving veterans and service animals and institutional indifference. By Thursday, Sato had received 3 separate inquiries from command asking if he was aware of the situation. By Friday morning, the corporate entity above Mercy General had also received inquiries, the kind of inquiries that required responses. I want to be clear, Sato said. We didn't come here to pressure anyone. We came because the right thing wasn't done, and because we have a relationship with this institution that I'd prefer to see maintained on the basis of values we actually share. If we can't share them, I'd like to know that too. The man in the suit was very still and very quiet beside him. Petra looked at the closed door of the administrative wing. What about Administrator Farley? She's in there, Sato said, with her supervisor and their legal team. He paused. I don't know what the outcome of that conversation will be. That's between them and their organization. But I was told you were still suspended, and I wanted to make sure you were here when the fog clears. Whatever happens, you should be able to walk back into your unit today, if that's what you want. She looked at him. You arranged that? We suggested it in fairly clear terms. Something in his expression softened just slightly. Mrs. Wynne, Kodiak has been with this unit for 4 years. He's worked 2 overseas deployments. The men and women in this unit have a particular feeling about that dog. He stopped, chose different words. You didn't have to help them. You didn't have to go to Bay 6. You made a decision and you stuck to it, and you paid for it. That's not something we're inclined to walk away from. She stood in the hallway of the hospital where she'd worked for 6 years, and she thought about the parking lot in the November cold, and the badge off her lanyard, and the 43 sutures, and the dog's eyes finding her face. I'd like my job back, she said. That's a reasonable request, said the man in the suit, and spoke for the first time. The conversation in the administrative wing lasted another hour and 40 minutes. Petra waited in the lobby with Cole and Kodiak, and Nakamura brought coffee from the vending alcove down the hall, which was terrible coffee, and the 3 of them drank it and did not talk very much. And Kodiak lay on the linoleum between Cole's feet and occasionally looked at Petra with the particular steady gaze she was already starting to think of as his. Jess came through the lobby at the end of her shift and stopped when she saw them. Is that the dog? Jess said. That's the dog, Petra said. Jess crouched down and let Kodiak sniff her hand. He gave her the same solemn lick on the wrist. Jess laughed, which was the first time Petra had laughed in 4 days, and it surprised her. Gail is on her way, Jess said. I know. Are you okay? Petra thought about it. Actually thought about it, instead of giving the automatic answer. "I think I'm going to be," she said. Gail arrived 12 minutes later with her briefcase and her expression of prepared readiness, and she took one look at the lobby. The colonel's group visible through the glass, the soldier and the dog, the corporate man who had just emerged from the administrative wing, looking like someone who had made several decisions he was hoping not to revisit, and she said to Petra, "Walk me through what's happened in the last hour." Petra walked her through it. Gail listened without interrupting, which was how you knew Gail was taking something seriously. When Petra finished, Gail looked at Cole, then at Nakamura, then back at Petra. "Full reinstatement," she said. "That's what's being discussed. With back pay for the suspension period? Apparently so." Gail set her briefcase down, picked it back up. "All right then," she said. Gwen Farley did not emerge from the administrative wing that day. What Petra learned, in the weeks that followed, came in pieces from Jess, who had sources inside the administrative structure that Petra had never fully understood. From Gail, who shared what she could, from a brief official communication that arrived through HR and said very little in very careful language. The review process had concluded. The suspension had been reversed. An internal process review would be conducted to ensure that emergency situations involving service animals were addressed within appropriate policy frameworks going forward. It did not say what had happened to Farley. Petra didn't ask. She came back to her shift on a Monday morning and found her locker exactly as she'd left it, and her name still on the rotation board, and a card taped to the inside of her locker door that said, in Jess's handwriting, "Welcome back, you stubborn pain in the ass. We saved you the good stethoscope." She stood at her locker for a moment, read the card twice, put it in her jacket pocket. She clipped her badge back onto her lanyard and went to work. Kodiak came back to the hospital one more time, about 6 weeks later, for what Cole said was a welfare check, but which Petra understood to be something else. The thing that happens when a bond gets formed in a crisis, and the people involved need to confirm, in person, that everyone is still all right. He was fully healed. You could see the scar line under his coat if you looked for it, but his gait was clean, and his eyes were clear, and when he walked into the lobby and located her across the room, his whole back end started moving with a happiness that was entirely undignified and entirely right. She crouched down and let him push his nose against her palm. Cole stood a few feet back. "He's been cleared for full duty," he said. "We deploy again in February." She looked up at him. "Both of you?" "Both of us." She looked back at Kodiak, at the scar she'd closed, at the dog who had looked at her with trusting, exhausted eyes at 11:47 on a Tuesday night and had apparently decided she was worth the trust. "Be careful," she said, to both of them. She was looking at Cole when she said it, but she meant it for Kodiak too, and she thought Cole probably understood that. "We will," he said. She watched them leave through the automatic doors, Cole's hand on Kodiak's harness, Kodiak's head turning back once to look at her before they went through, and she stood in the lobby of Mercy General and felt the morning shift beginning around her, the sounds of the hospital coming alive, the way it always did, relentless and necessary in hers, and she thought, this is the job. This is exactly the job. She went back to the nurse's station. She picked up a chart. She started her day.